Thank you very much, Carrie, and thank you everyone for coming. I think this is not so much a conference as a constellation. My granddaughter, who's 14 months, recently received a Christmas present of 2 giraffes. Not only giraffes, but age and sex matched pairs of zebras, tigers, crocodiles, elephants, snakes, and hippopotami. Plus a boat to travel in and an old man in a beard to sail it. And in due course, we're going to have to explain to her that all this was made by a man in his 91st year, in one of the last creative acts of a hugely long, productive life. This evening at the Pearce Institute in Govan, we'll celebrate Julian Tudor Hart, the man, but at this conference we are going to remember, celebrate, and travel forward with the doctor. As a GP in West London in the 50s, one of Julian's patients was Paul Robeson, the American singer, communist, and civil rights activist. And the music Julian chose for his funeral last July included Paul Robeson singing the ballad of Joe Hill. You may know it. I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you or me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, says he. I never died, says he. And in a sense, Julian didn't die either, because he's still a presence in his writing, his ideas, and his example. And that's what we're celebrating, not looking back on past achievements. Julian wouldn't have liked that. Rather looking ahead with colleagues, organizing, planning the future, concentrating on what we can do. We think it's a conference that Julian would have liked to attend. Why Glasgow? Lots of reasons. His paper on patients as co-producers came from a seminar held in the Glasgow University Department. The university gave him an honorary degree, the only one it's given to a GP in over 100 years. His 80th birthday symposium was held here, as was a memorable joint occasion with the late David Donison, the two of them giants of social medicine, asking Lenin's question, what then shall we do? The idea for which began with a kitchen conversation between the two of them, reminiscing about how they'd heard the result of the 1945 general election. But Julian's Scottish connections go deeper. His middle name was Macbeth, after his maternal grandfather, Norman Macbeth, born in Glasgow, educated in Edinburgh, an apprentice engineer. In 1871, he worked in the drawing office of Messrs. Todd and MacGregor, shipbuilders in Partick, shown here between the rivers Kelvin and Clyde, before he moved with his wife, Annie McNichol, from Helensburgh to Bolton, where they worked for 30 years and raised a family of 9 children. The eldest of whom, Anne Macbeth, was one of the Glasgow girls, an associate of Jessie Newberry and Charles Rennie Mackintosh at the School of Art, where she was head of needlecraft and embroidery, also a suffragette, designed a banner for the famous Edinburgh procession, for which she was imprisoned, put in solitary and force-fed in 1912. As a teenager, Julian spent summer holidays with his aunt at her home in the Lake District. Julian's other grandfather, Percival Tudor Hart, on the left, was from a family of Canadian engineers in mining. His father sent him to study medicine in Paris, which he couldn't stomach, but like Berlioz. So he left to become a painter. And cut off from parental support, because he was cut off, he was a starving artist, a fellow student of Henri Matisse, a neighbor of Toulouse-Lautrec. When his career picked up, he taught painting in Paris, then London, before returning to Canada. His first wife, Eleonora Kleksowska, called Nellie to her intimates, came from Polish aristocracy and died young from tuberculosis. It's the plot of La Bohème. Julian spent World War II in Canada with his grandparents. The Tudors and the Harts were closely related Canadian business families. The combined surname arose when Percival's mother, a Tudor, divorcing his father, a Hart, wanted to keep both names. The families included Ephraim Hart, a Bavarian Jew and New York merchant and politician, and Frederick Tudor, the Boston ice king, who made his fortune exporting ice before refrigeration from Massachusetts to Cuba and India. Anne Macbeth's sister was also a doctor, Alison Macbeth. And in 1926, she married Alexander Tudor Hart, on the left, also a doctor, born in Florence, the son of Percival. Pay attention. They split up when Julian was 3, his father going on to fight in the Spanish Civil War, having married Edith Susitsky in Center in Vienna, enabling her to become Edith Tudor Hart and to live in the UK as an emigre. She was a photographer, you see her pictures, also a KGB agent and spy master for the Cambridge Four, Maclean, Philby, Blunt and Burgess. As Julian said in the recent documentary Tracking Edith, he had little contact with his stepmother. He was brought up in Woburn Square in Bloomsbury by his mother, Alison Macbeth, a single parent and a GP who became an endocrinologist. It's a complicated background. Based on his grandparents and where he lived, Julian could have played rugby for Scotland, England, Wales, Italy, France, and Canada. And from his aunt Anne and grandfather Percival, we can see where he got his eye and hand for a line. In the last 60 years of his life, of course, he lived and worked in South Wales. Qualifying in 1952, he wanted to be a general practitioner in a coal mining community, partly following his father's footsteps, partly due to the romance of mining practice as described in Cronin's novel The Citadel, but mainly because, as a privileged person, that was the type of community he wanted to belong to. Working for the MRC epidemiology unit in the Ronde de Vache, he observed many serious clinical cases which, as a researcher, he could do nothing about. So he left, exchanging, in words he quoted from the Go-Between, a life of facts for the facts of life, moving to single-handed practice in the mining village of Glencorrig in West Glamorgan. The work was hard, with huge surgeries and waiting lists. It took 5 years to reach a stable position, working through the unmet need, but more significantly, marrying Mary Thomas, whom he'd met at the MRC unit. They were married for 55 years. His story is her story, and vice versa. The book is dedicated to both of them. So much of what Julian Tudor Hart pioneered is orthodox now. He was the first doctor in the world to measure the blood pressures of all his patients, famously the last man to take part at the highest blood pressure in the village. It's still an important teaching lesson. Julian and Mary put records into shape, converting from Lloyd George to A4 to establish the information system that allowed them to start by screening the records, not the patients, and to measure what they hadn't done, the measurement of omission, so they could describe, address, and reduce the rule of halves. Later, Julian described a cohort of hypertensive diagnosed under 40, followed up for 20 years, and was his own coroner, reviewing over 500 consecutive deaths in general practice. After 25 years involving 210,000 patient encounters, averaging 180 per week, a prodigious workload, he could show 30% lower premature mortality compared with a neighboring population, partly by delivering evidence-based medicine, but also unconditional personalized continuity of care for all his patients. Julian showed that long-term commitment to a particular community can improve health, lengthen lives, and narrow health inequalities. And he did it in the most deprived community in West Glamorgan, confounding his own inverse care law. In his own way and time, Julian imagined and realized the exceptional potential not only of consultations, as described in the seminal paper by Stoughton Davis, but also of general practice as a system capable of improving the health of a whole community. In A New Kind of Doctor, his book, Julian looked back at the care of a man invalided out of the steel industry with a set of problems we now call multi-morbidity. Overall, the story is a success. For the staff at our health centre, it was a steady and glamorous slog through a total of 310 consultations. For me, about 41 hours of work with the patient, initially face-to-face, gradually shifting to side-by-side. Professionally, the most satisfying and exciting things have been the events which have not happened. No strokes, no heart attacks, no complications of diabetes, no kidney failure. This is the real stuff of primary medical care. At a seminar in the Glasgow department, we asked Julian what happened to this man. He died of something else, I think a late-onset cancer. But when Julian told us this, there was a tear in his eye. The patient had become his friend. By his own admission, Julian began as an authoritarian, rather paternalistic doctor. But he changed. He had to change. Initially face-to-face, gradually shifting to side-by-side. Julian was talking and writing about co-production and the pace at which it could be achieved in a deprived community 20 years before it became a policy catchword. Julian counted as a scientist anyone who measured or audited what they did and was honest with the results. Galileo Galilei was his favourite play. He often quoted the line, "The figures compel us." Julian didn't pursue scientific knowledge for its own sake or for academic advancement, but always with the direct purpose of helping to improve patients' lives. Glencorrig was the first UK general practice to receive research funding from the MRC. Mary and Julian had both worked with Archie Cochrane and his team at the MRC Epidemiology Unit, where they'd learned a democratic type of research in which everybody's contribution was important, and the study wasn't complete until everyone had taken part. And so in Glencorrig there was what was called locally the SHIT study, the P study, the SALT studies, and the rat poison study, all with very high response rates. He wouldn't be allowed to do that now. Research ethics committees would stop him. They see research on your own patients as being coercive. They're strong on patients' rights, weak on patient responsibilities. Julian's view was that if people wished to benefit from research evidence, they should contribute to its making. Exclusions weakened the evidence. But it was always a partnership, research with patients, not on patients. The public meeting explaining a cancer study and captured on film by the BBC still astonishes as an example of community engagement. And the community studies of salt restriction with never to be repeated levels of engagement was built on trust. Many young doctors were attracted and inspired to work at the unofficial University of Glencorrig, shown here at a reunion. At least 6 are here today. We were hairier then. He was a prolific writer of research papers, articles, and books. His books translated into several languages, including Spanish and Chinese. He lectured widely, at his exhilarating best when speaking impromptu. Here he is, bottom left, with a cartoon celebrating a meeting with Italian colleagues in Verona. And one of them, Franco Delzotti, is sorry he couldn't be with us here today. The problem with medical education, Julian said, was that students were being taught the wrong things by the wrong people in the wrong place. Intellectual opposition to social injustice, even when present, is only the beginning of understanding. If students are to retain patient-oriented rather than disease-oriented, they must learn to identify in complex, concrete, detailed terms with people they know only as crude stereotypes and of whom they are usually afraid. Several colleagues have referred to this paper in the book. Standing for election to RCGP Council, Julian topped the poll. During council meetings, he sketched senior college figures. But his image making went far beyond cartoons. What he offered GPs was an image of themselves as important members of the medical profession, alongside specialists, not beneath them. The writing was important, finding a language that described the work of general practitioners not only as it was, but as it could be. Julian was humble in himself, but ambitious for his ideas. He accepted with ambivalence the honours and sentimental treatment that came with age, but he never lost his edge. And if we are to celebrate his life, it should be by holding to the principles he held dear. The work of a general practitioner is immeasurably enhanced by working in, with, and for a local community for long enough to make a difference. Everyone is important. The last person is important as the first, and the work isn't done until everyone is on board. Julian was the worried doctor, anticipating patients' problems, not waiting for them to happen, then avoiding them by joint endeavour. Drawing on Marx, he saw healthcare as a form of production, producing not profits but social value, shared knowledge, confidence, the ability to live well with conditions, achieved not by the doctor alone, but by doctors and patients working together. Patients were partners, not customers or consumers. The NHS should never be a business to make money, but a social institution based on mutuality and trust, the ultimate gift economy, getting what you need, giving what you can, a model for how society might be run as a whole. And in rebuilding society, cooperation would trump competition, not marginally, but as steam once surpassed horsepower. The Glencorrig research studies showed glimpses of that social power. In addressing the exceptional potential of general practice, Julian left unfinished business, the business of forging alliances, not with power or the establishment, that's a prescription for things to stay as they are, but with patients, colleagues, and communities. Accountability not just upwards, although that's necessary, but also downwards to local communities and horizontally to colleagues, so that progressive practice is a force to be reckoned with. Lone voices and lone examples are insufficient as drivers of change. Endorsing general practice in the deep end, he wrote, "Everything depends on leaders at practice level, demanding media attention, gaining public support, insisting on material resourcing from governments, in return for which they can guarantee immensely greater efficiency of care generated by people who know each other." Julian's gift to us is not the example he worked out in the microcosm of a Welsh mining village over 25 years ago. It's the present challenge of how to follow and give practical expression to his values in local communities in the future. Thank you.